Hello everyone, we are back at it again for our final lecture from the language chapter in our third unit of AP Human Geography. Tonight we're going to be mainly finishing up with language. We're going to look at several different aspects from conflict to language creation to language extinction. So a lot of different elements that are going to go into tonight's lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. First part that we see up here is just a few different definitions, definitely something that we're going to want to know. Fairly intuitive just based on the terms themselves. So let's take a look. Monolingualism is a society or country's use of only one language for all purposes of communication. Mono, the prefix there meaning one. So if you knew that, you'd know that that's just one language. Bilingualism, the prefix bi, meaning two, describing a society's use of two official languages. And then multilingualism, multi meaning multiple, common use of two or more. That's important, two or more languages in a society or country. Now, what's kind of interesting with this is when you start having multiple languages spoken, we have to kind of talk about the impact of that. So on this slide, let's go ahead and take a look at a few different areas where multiple languages are spoken and some conflict may arise. Two different regions of the world here, Africa and Europe, and let's take a look at a couple different examples. Again, always good to have some specific real-world examples for us to draw from in the event that we ever need it on a FRQ. So in Nigeria, a wealth of language diversity in Nigeria. Over 500 languages spoken, and depending on your source, it actually might be higher than that. Three different language families that are predominant: Afro-Asiatic, which is predominantly Arabic, Nilo-Saharan, as well as Niger-Congo. Now, because there is so much language diversity in Nigeria, one thing that the government of the country decided to do was actually move the capital. This is another example of a forward thrust capital, vocabulary term that we haven't yet defined but will define in our political unit. Essentially, when a country moves its capital city, particularly inland. We've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in Cote d'Ivoire, we see it again here in Nigeria. They moved their capital city from Lagos, which is on the coast, to Abuja, which is further inland. And in an attempt to try and balance out and grant, greater recognition of the language diversity that exists throughout the country. Now, what actually makes this even more fascinating in Nigeria is the fact that of all these different languages and the different language families that are widely spoken, the official language of the country isn't from any of them. The official language of the country is actually English, dating back to its time as a British colony. And so once again, we see the impact of colonialism on language. Now, moving to a different region, we can look at Europe. Now, if your initial reaction was, well, if there's a lot of languages, there must be conflict. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of languages to have language conflict. And Belgium is a really good example. In Flemings, which is the northern part of Belgium, they speak Flemish, which is a variant of Dutch, and the northern part of Belgium borders on the Netherlands, which is where they speak Dutch. In the southern part, which is Walloon, they speak French, and that is along the southern border, or near the southern border, which borders on France. So there's kind of a geographic divide within the country between north and south as far as languages. And the country is legally, the capital specifically in Brussels is legally bilingual. It is in the center of the country. But there have been separatist movements to actually divide Belgium into two different countries. to give greater autonomy to the different regions, the different cultures, and especially here, the different languages. Now, with that being said, just because you have multiple languages doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be conflict. And Switzerland is a good example of that, where you're going to see several different languages spoken: German, French, Italian, Romanian or Romanish. All four are official languages, and there's not really a lot of conflict over it. So that is something where we have to be cautious in saying, well, if there's multiple languages, there's going to be conflict. Not always is that the case. And just because there's a lot of languages doesn't guarantee that there's going to be conflict, because we can have conflict with only a few languages. So this gives us a nice sampling to see how multiple languages can impact language conflict and so forth. And I like to include at this point a map looking at language in Australia, specifically native Australians or Aboriginal language in Australia, and to see how diverse the language map is in Australia. And it's not something that we typically hear a whole lot about. And this gives us a sense of just how diverse the language is in Australia, particularly amongst native Australians. Transitioning a bit again, this is a term that we have talked quite a bit about. It is a term that has been on the AP exam as an FRQ, and so it's definitely a major concept, and it is something that I would definitely be familiar with. I would anticipate seeing this as a multiple choice question. Probably not a FRQ question, because it's been fairly recently on as an FRQ question, but definitely anticipate a multiple choice question about this. Certainly on my test, and maybe even on the AP exam. A lingua franca. And a lingua franca is a common language, a language used among speakers of different languages for the purposes of trade and commerce. And so essentially what a lingua franca is, when you have two people who don't speak the same native language, first language or standard language, there's going to be some language that they might be able to communicate in. And so English is a really good example of that. We're going to talk about this map here in just a minute. There's a couple other examples from different regions of the world. In Africa, Swahili serves as a great example of a lingua franca being used by 50 million Africans as a second language, despite relatively few people speaking it as a first language. Tagalog in the Philippines is another good example of a lingua franca. There's a lot of regional dialects, a lot of local languages that are spoken, and then Tagalog is oftentimes a secondary language that a lot of people speak to kind of bind together and communicate with people from different regions. So other examples to draw from for this. We're going to talk about the internet here in just a minute, but let's talk about this map for a second. First off, what type of map are we looking at, and at what scale are we analyzing this? And you'll notice that this is, once again, a choropleth map, national scale. And each of the choropleth classes correspond with different designations for English. The darkest orange that you see there is English that is official and most widely used. The middle shade of orange that you see in probably the most amount of countries on here is where English is official but not widely used. And then finally, the last one, the almost yellow shade there, is where English is not official but is widely used. Now, there's a couple things that I want to point out. We mentioned Nigeria just a moment ago, where English is the official language but is not widely used. So when you take a look at the map there, we can see that. Many of the countries on here where English is official are former British colonies. And so that is an important thing to remember. Not all of these former British colonies have this as an official language, but a lot of the ones that do are former British colonies. And even some that aren't official, like in Egypt, it's not an official language, but Egypt was a former British colony. but it declared its independence much longer ago than some of these other states where it is official. And that's something we're going to talk about in our political geography. But there's one other thing that I want to point out that I'm actually not even going to point out. I want to ask a question. I want you to be able to recognize this. There's a mistake on here. There's a mistake on this map, and I want to see if you guys can pick it out. Based on the conversations we've had about official languages and things like that, what is the issue with this map? There's a problem. There's a mistake. Point that out, because we're going to talk about that. So I mentioned that we were going to take a look at the internet, and this is taken from a longer infographic. But in this particular case, this is looking at web page language statistics, specifically the percentage of web pages that are published by language. And you'll notice on here that English is by far and away the most published language of the internet. Despite not being the most widely spoken first language in the world, it is the most widely used official language, but not the most widely spoken first language. And you'll notice that the most widely spoken first language, Mandarin, isn't even represented here. It's in the else category, and so we don't even know what percentage that would be. Now, this is important for our understanding of lingua francas because English is used so widely on the internet. It's important to understand that many people are going to learn English as a second language in order to be connected. And so that is something that is important to understand, and the diffusion of English as a result is going to be much more broad than some of these other languages. And so that's an important thing to remember. Shifting gears a little bit, now we're going to talk a little bit about language change. Right? And we start out with a definition. A pidgin language is a form of speech that adopts a simplified grammar and limited vocabulary of a lingua franca. So it takes a lingua franca, condenses it down. And it's really just used in the same manner as a lingua franca between two people who don't speak the same native language. But it's just a more simplified form of this. All right? And typically you're not going to see the same grammar rules. You're not going to see the same kind of vocabulary, same level of vocabulary. It's going to be very, very simplified. There might be, certain words that are especially prominent. And it is important to understand that a pidgin language is no one's native language. All right, there are no native speakers of a pidgin language because it is a simplified form of a lingua franca. Now, people might learn a lingua franca, and that is their second language, but a pidgin language is a much more simplified form of that. All right, so it's not going to be anyone's native language. It's not going to be anyone's first language because if they are learning, let's say, English, which is a good example of a lingua franca, and increasingly so, they're learning that as their native language. English is their native language, not a pidgin form of English. So that's important to understand. However, Creole is essentially when a pidgin language becomes the native language of a group of people. All right? But if you're like, wait a minute, I thought pidgin languages couldn't be native, so how then could this be native? Really what we're saying is when a pidgin language, a simplified form of, let's say, a lingua franca, evolves into the native language of a particular group of people, we no longer call it a pidgin language, we call it Creole. Right? And oftentimes, this is combined with another language. So, for example, and this is a good example, when you see the next point, it says a mix between colonizers and indigenous people. So when we take, let's say, French Creole, which we do see used in the United States, particularly like in Louisiana and that area, Maine to a certain extent, French Creole takes some of the basic words of French language, combines it with indigenous language in order to create almost a new form of French. Right? It's not French. People aren't speaking French. They're speaking words of French, but it's a different form of it. All right, and so that's when a pidgin language where they've taken a couple of those words, now we've combined it with something else. Now we call it Creole, French Creole, for example. So it's really kind of tricky there because it's a subtle nuance between pidgin language and Creole. An isolated language is, there's another definition, a language that is unrelated to any other languages and therefore not attached to any language family. And Korean is an example, at least from our textbook, of an isolated language. So too would be Japanese. But there are some arguments that Korean is actually part of the Altaic language family, as with Japanese, part of the Altaic language family. But in much of East Asia, Sino-Tibetan is the dominant language family, and Korean and Japanese certainly isolated from that. They're not part of that language family. All right, they formed their own independent language families, at least according to our textbook. I don't necessarily like that as the best example. The next example that you see on there, Basque, is a great example of an isolated language. All right, and there are theories that the Basque language is actually part of the Nostratic superfamily that we talked about in an earlier lecture. But the Basque region, which is in northern Spain, southwest France, is isolated from the Romance languages of Indo-European. And the theory was that at one point, Basque was part of this Nostratic superfamily. And it remained, largely due to isolation, it remained that true form of Nostratic, where Indo-European then evolved into its own branch and diffused in a different way. And so really fascinating to think about. And put a star next to Basque because that's, I would say, the better example of an isolated language. All right, our textbook uses Korean as an example. Basque, I think, is actually an even better example of an isolated language. So the fascinating thing about languages is that they do change. We talked about, a lingua franca becoming a pidgin language becoming a Creole language. So we talked about that progression. We talked about how languages can be isolated and so on and so forth. But it's important to understand that languages can be created as well. And Esperanto was created to be an international, secondary language, intended to be kind of a neutral lingua franca is one way that I've heard it described, in that it didn't place any specific preference on any one particular European language. Right? So instead of using the language of one particular colonizing country, it was intended to be neutral and combine elements from lots of different languages, like Latin, English, German, Polish, Russian, so on and so forth. And there's actually been a movie that was published in Esperanto. It's estimated that there are 2 million speakers, not native speakers, but speakers of Esperanto. So really kind of fascinating that this language is just created, just came into existence because someone wanted it to. And so now is really kind of a fun opportunity to talk about how language changes over time, because languages can be created, languages are modified. Every single year, we add new words to the dictionary. Words that come into being, words that are especially prominent and significant. So we're going to take a look at that in class. We'll look at the words that were added to the dictionary this year. But we also borrow words from other languages. And so this is a series of 11 different words, and I am not going to try and pronounce them because I would butcher them. I would do a disservice to the languages and how elegant I'm sure most of these words sound once said. I would butcher them, so I'm not going to say them. But I will say their meanings. And these are just single words that represent different feelings, different concepts, different things like that. It's just kind of fun. It's not anything that you need to take notes on. In fact, I don't even think it's part of your note packet. Right? So just kind of sit back and enjoy some of these different terms. And I would love, if you happen to be from a household that speaks these different languages, I would love to hear how they're pronounced, because it's just fascinating. So in German, there is a word for the feeling of being alone in the woods, which to me would be a terrifying feeling. In Italian, there is a term for the mark left on a table by a cold glass. In Inuit, the feeling of anticipation that leads you to keep looking outside to see if anyone is coming. I'm so guilty of this, it is not even funny. Every time we have like a little gathering, we have people over for dinner, I'm always like looking out the peephole of the door. Are they here yet? So there's a word for that, and I'm guilty of it. In Japanese, the sunlight that filters through the leaves of trees. There's a term for that. In Russian, there is a term for a person who asks a lot of questions. In Spanish, a term for the time spent after lunch or dinner talking to the people you shared the meal with. In Indonesian, this one is a little near and dear to my heart, a joke told so poorly and so unfunny that one cannot help but laugh. That's basically every joke I've ever told. And most of my students are just like so kind and polite that they laugh at it. But yeah, that, I don't know, the hashtag dad jokes, right? I guess. That's like pretty much every joke I tell. So bad, so not funny that you're like, it's so ridiculous, I'm going to laugh. So I should probably actually learn this term, because that is my life. In Hawaiian, the act of scratching your head in order to help you remember something that you have forgotten. I literally scratched my head as I was saying this, almost like I'd forgotten. Anyway. In French, the feeling that comes from not being in one's home country. I'd be interested in this. This one always kind of makes me wonder, is it like a good feeling, like an exciting feeling, like I'm experiencing something new, or is it like a feeling of dread, like homesick? I've always kind of wondered that. In Urdu, the transporting suspension of disbelief that can occur in, as in good storytelling, like when somebody tells a story and you can see it, you can almost imagine being there. There's a word for that. And finally, in Swedish, the road-like reflection of the moon on the water. And so these are just terms I always I like to do this. It's fun. It's not super academic, but it's something that relates to language and how words might perhaps be added to different languages. So back to the concept of creating language or modifying language. This is an article, again, not super academic, but something kind of interesting. I am a big Game of Thrones fan, and it's not super school appropriate. But there is a particular language in Game of Thrones, a group of people called the Dothraki. And in the show, they actually have their own language. They communicate. And the creators of the Game of Thrones show actually created a contest for someone to create the Dothraki language, like actually create it, bring it into existence. So there is vocabulary, there are grammar rules, and at one point in the show, one of the characters misused the constructed language, that you can see it there, conlang. Misused the language. They had to rewrite the language so that the mistake that the actor made was actually grammatically correct. And so I find this interesting just from like a popular culture standpoint, that you could have just, written the words that are on the page, but no, they actually went so far as to actually create a language. And so I include there a little bit of Dothraki there asking, how are you? Which I guess directly translates to, do you ride well? The Dothraki are people who ride on horses, and that's an important part of their culture. All right, last little bit tonight. If languages can be created, obviously they can disappear. You'll perhaps remember from the very first lecture in this unit, we talked about that languages disappear about once every 14 days. Of those 7,000 languages that exist, about once every 14 days, one disappears forever. And so there are actually people who are in the business, the industry of trying to preserve these, going to different areas, meeting with people who are native speakers, and just recording it. Listening to people talk, recording it, so that we have evidence of these languages. So before, someone dies or before people stop speaking it, we have evidence that these languages existed. And so an extinct language, a definition for us, a language that was once used by people in daily activities but is no longer used. And Hebrew is a good example, or was a good example, of an extinct language. And so we have to notice in the definition that it doesn't mean that it's gone forever. It just means that it was used in daily activities and is no longer used. Right? So it can still have been preserved, but it's just not used in daily activities. All right? So Hebrew actually disappeared around the 4th century BCE, with the exception of, and this is very important, religious ceremonies, religious practices, religious texts, religious schools, that preserved the language. And it was largely replaced by Aramaic and Arabic within the area of the Eastern Mediterranean. However, when Israel was recognized as an official state in 1948, Hebrew was an obvious choice as an official language. And in addition to that, Arabic is one of the other official languages, particularly in the Arab portions of Israel. And so this is a really fascinating example of how a language was preserved, was protected by religious ceremonies, religious texts, and how it was preserved over a huge amount of time, and quite literally came back from extinction. It wasn't used in daily activities, and now it most certainly is. And to see the evolution of the Hebrew language, because there were words that didn't exist in the Jewish religious texts that now are part of the Hebrew language, that were created in order to help preserve and ensure that the Hebrew language didn't actually disappear forever. Really a fascinating case study. But last little bit of information here looks at European languages, and there's about 250 languages spoken in Europe. But as you can see on here, the question is for how long? Because about 90% of those 250 languages are endangered. 90% are endangered, and that includes both endangered as well as critically endangered. So out of 250, about 225 are some variation of endangered. And they're going to be the much smaller languages that we're a little less familiar with. This isn't Spanish and French and German that we're talking about. We're talking about much smaller languages. And they actually have specific designations for what we mean by endangered versus critically endangered. And so it's important to understand that as much as language can be created, it can go away, it can disappear, and it does disappear. And so that's something that we have to be aware of. But we'll continue this conversation in class. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I'll see you tomorrow.